Welcome to my transparent watercolor tutorial, Understanding Negative Painting. In this tutorial, I'm going to use a simple exercise using leafy shapes to illustrate how I approach and think about negative painting. I think sometimes the simplest concepts are hard to get a grasp of because we tend to gravitate and like complexity. We tend to read more into what's really there. To me, when you're talking about negative painting, you're talking about working with positive and negative shapes. And the way I define what's positive or negative for myself is if I'm working on the interior edge of a shape, I consider that I'm working positive. If I'm working around the exterior edge of a shape, I consider it a negative shape. As I said, I'm going to use a simple exercise working with leafy shapes to illustrate negative painting. So what I have is I've collected some leaves from out my backyard. It's fall here. And I'm just going to draw the outline of these leaf shapes. And I'm going to create a pattern of overlap with these shapes. So then we're going to come in and do some painting in positive and negative space. Here I'm continuing to outline the leaf shapes, and I've picked a variety of sizes to make it more interesting of a composition, even though it's an exercise. So just gather some leaves, or you can use some other simple shape if you want. You could use shells or anything and do the same exercise, but just outline them randomly just to make an interesting pattern. And here I'm drawing in my final leaf shape. So I've gone across the whole page and I'm touching the edges of the paper so the leaves are going off and they're going over top of one another. In order to make my composition a bit more interesting, I'm going to give the indication of some stems running over top and behind some of these leaf shapes. It just makes it more interesting with some of these linear shapes in the composition. So now that I have my composition drawn, what I want to do is I'm going to come in with just a loose wash to start this off. It doesn't really matter what colors you're using, but I've just got a couple colors here, kind of fall colors, just to make it interesting and feel like fall. So I'm just randomly putting in some brush strokes here of color, and one of the things I want to try and do here is I want to try and preserve some of the white of the paper as I apply this wash. So I'm just randomly putting it over this composition. Here I'm coming in with a green tone just to liven this up a little bit and give some variety of color. And now I've got a purple tone that I'm working in here. So I've just chosen these colors to make it interesting. You could just stick with one color if you want to keep it simple. The important thing to remember here is we're just focused on trying to understand working with negative space. So I'm softening this wash up with a spray bottle, and I'm going to blot it a little bit with a Kleenex and try and save some of these highlights. Because even though this is an exercise, I'm going to try and have a bit of a center of interest, an area where some of the lights and the contrast is at its greatest. To me, one of the really neat things about an exercise like this is you're creating art. You're not focused on trying to copy a photograph, which I just feel too often we do, which inhibits the creative process. Right now you've sketched some leaves and you're coming in with random color to put a wash, a foundation wash on. and you're just creating art. So now I have my drawing and I have a foundation wash. So let's talk a little bit about positive and negative shapes. I have all these leafy shapes, some on top of others, and when I'm working on as I said, the interior edge of a shape, I consider I'm working on a positive shape. When I work around the exterior edge, it's a negative shape. So if you look at the small leaf, if I were painting the top of this leaf, which is how we often would start, and painting on the interior edge of this shape, I'd say I'm working in positive space. If I were working around the exterior edge of that shape and putting a wash down on the exterior edge, to me now I'm working in negative space. Even though the area I'm painting is the top of another leaf, I'm focusing my wash around the exterior edge of the small leaf. Now, when I work with a leaf such as the one to the right of the small leaf, it's negative when I'm working along the edge of the small leaf, but now the relationship of that middle leaf to the one to the right becomes a positive negative relationship, because now I'm going to be working around the exterior edge of that leaf. So a shape can be both positive and negative depending on what area you're working around. And again, for me to keep it in context, I say if you're working on the interior edge of a shape, it's positive, and if you're working on the exterior edge of a shape, it's negative. So let's apply some paint. So we're going to start to work in the negative space around this smaller leafy shape. So I've come in with a smaller brush, and you could do this with a large brush too, but I'm just taking a wash and I'm gradating it away from the exterior edge of this small leaf shape, and by doing that, that starts to send this small leaf shape forward. So I haven't actually put any paint outside of my wash on the small leaf shape, but by working along the exterior edge and gradating the wash against it, I've started to describe that shape of the small leaf. That, to me, it's a very simple concept. Working along the exterior edge, it's negative space, and you start to send areas back and bring other areas forward because you're working negative space. Now, I'm working along the exterior edge of this second leaf, and it's the same thing. I'm gradating the wash away from the exterior edge of that leafy shape, and so now that's the positive shape, where when I was working with a small leaf, I was working in negative space even though I was working on that same leaf. So my wash is coming away from the exterior edge, making that edge on the interior my positive shape. So I've done this to a few leaves at this point, and you can see how if you break down a more complex painting, it's just the buildup of many of these actions. So you're painting around many exterior edges and interior edges, because when you're doing a painting, you actually work both in positive and negative space. But when it all gets tied together in a very large painting, it looks very complex, and it can be, but it's nothing more than a buildup of these simple actions of painting around interior and exterior edges of shapes. So here's a good example of what I'm talking about. This looks much more complex than what we've started here, but when you really break it down, it's the buildup of painting along the interior and exterior edges of positive and negative shapes. this painting started with a foundation wash like our exercise, and then it was a ongoing build-up of working in positive, negative shapes, building up values. It has many more layers than what our exercise will have, but it's a good illustration of the process that I'm talking about and trying to get this simple concept of working in and out of positive and negative space. Have you ever seen somebody post a picture of a flower they've done on Facebook and they ask if they should do a background? They say they really like the painting and trying to decide if they should do a background. If I had painted just the positive shapes in this composition, just working on the interior edge of these leaves, just painting the leaves without any background, it would be a far less interesting composition. For me personally, I like to develop my whole composition as a unit. I don't work from one corner to the other, and when I reach the other side, I'm done. I gradually build my values and develop the composition as a whole. Working this way, I feel for myself, gives me the best opportunity to explore working in and out of positive and negative space. So here I am back with our exercise, working along the interior and exterior edges of these leaf shapes and the linear stem shapes that I drew in. What I'm going to do is speed this video up and take a few moments to watch the buildup of the composition that I talked about. I'm going to continue to work in interior and exterior edges and start to develop the values, and you start to see this composition come together. But keep those simple concepts in mind of working on the interior and exterior edges of positive and negative shapes. All right, I'm going to slow things down again and start talking a little bit more about this process. I hope you could see the buildup that I was talking about as we went through some of that painting with the music. Here I'm just taking a light wash, kind of a middle value wash of green, and I'm working around some of the negative space, just tying the composition together a bit. And you can see here where I take advantage to send that linear shape of the stem forward by putting this wash on the exterior edges of that linear shape. And now for me, this is where some of the real fun part comes in. I've laid my foundation wash and I've built up some of my positive and negative shapes using primarily middle value. And now I come in with a very dark value and start working around in positive and negative space to really send some of these objects forward and send some of the others further back in the background. You can see it's a very dark value, and when you place this right beside your very light values or whites, it really starts to make this pop. And you can see how you work in negative space here by, like, this dark tone I'm applying. It's a shape, it's a dark shape in the background, and I have that stem coming over top of it, and then it splits that shape, but it starts to give overlap, which helps create depth and gives dimension to the composition. And I just come in and work around the composition, trying to decide where I need my darker values. I try and follow design principles, which I won't get into in this video, but just focus on the positive and negative shape aspects of this. I like to take stem shapes or long linear shapes, and I'll start them on the edge of one shape and bring them out on the other side, and that just makes it more believable when that overlap that's created, and it helps create depth to the composition. I continue to put these little touches of value around the exterior edges of some of these leaf shapes, and that dark value really starts to send the shape forward. I look at some of these intersections where one shape comes over top of another, and here I is where I take these linear shapes and I put them in between like two leaf shapes here, these stems, and it's back in negative space, but it helps create dimension. And here you can see where I start on one side of the leaf and pick it up on the other, and on the other side there, that really helps send those, that's just that little bit of a linear shape helps bring that leaf shape forward, and again starts to build depth in the painting. And when you continue to build up layer after layer after layer of this, you can see how, while it's a very simple process, it does appear to be very complex when you get this continual buildup of these layers of positive and negative painting. So when I'm painting like this and bringing in these linear shapes and some of these little dark value shapes that I put in here, I'm putting them between the exterior edges of positive shapes. Now I'm coming in with a little bit of a stronger wash, working along the exterior edge again, and this starts to tie this more and more together with some of these final washes that I'm putting on. To me, this is a way to use negative painting to bring more attention to your focal point or center of interest. I'm taking this fairly bright wash and I'm placing it around around the exterior edges of this shape, and it really starts to send that small leaf shape out, and that tone around the exterior edges really starts to bring your attention to it. And it's a way you can use this negative painting to help bring the eye, draw the eye in, draw the viewer into your composition and look where you want them to look. As we near the end of this video, I hope I've been able to illustrate to you the concept of working in positive and negative space in a manner that's easy to understand. It's this gradual buildup working in and out of positive and negative space, working on the interior and exterior edges of shapes that leads to a finished product and what appears on the surface to be a very complex composition. The more you work with this concept and experiment with it, you'll see that there's great benefit to working with positive and negative space, whether you're doing an exercise like this where you're working with random leaves, or if you're doing a painting that involves photographic reference. You still have many opportunities to work in and out of positive and negative space when you're working from a photograph and trying to recreate an image that you're working from. The more you experiment with working in positive and negative space, the more comfortable you'll get with it. This is my approach, and this is how I think about positive and negative space when I speak working on the interior and exterior edges of shapes. And I do use the word shapes a lot because that's how I try to think when I paint. I hope you've got some benefit out of this, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. And as we wind this video down, I'm going to close it out with some examples of some of my paintings where I've tried to utilize this same concept where I'm working on positive negative shapes and gradually build up to what can be a very complex composition. Now here are a few samples, and thanks for watching.